You are the best people evolved for mankind because you enjoin the good and you forbid the evil. America's greatest chance, without a doubt, are the Muslims who do their job.
Let us be very, very clear that our presence here in the United States of America is the best thing that ever happened to this country.
The first modern nation anywhere on the face of the earth to abolish the institution of slavery was in West Africa. Islam was present in what became the United States of America before there was a United States of America.
Our job is simply to show the oneness of Allah. That's our struggle. And if we do that, America benefits.
We live in a country where we need to understand our history as Muslims. Islam has been on the shores of this nation since the days of its founding. This country right here is our country, and we deserve to live here like everybody else.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala barakatuhu. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على بدر التمام اللهم صل على النور الظلام اللهم صل على مفتاح الدار السلام اللهم صل على شفيع في جميع الأنام سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Beloved brothers, sisters, elders, I come to address you on the topic of how we understand the history of African Islam and the foundations of the Muslim community in America. I teach African history and Islamic history at the University of Michigan, and so much of my talk today will be drawn from a 14-week-long course on the history of Islam in Africa that we will cover in about 20 minutes. As they say in Chinese, it'll be like watching flowers from horseback. So stay with me, we're gonna go fast. But I wanna just say one quick thing first in response to Sheikh Abdullah's wonderful talk before I actually get into the substance of the lecture today. And it's to introduce this historical material that I'm going to give you about Islam in Africa and its relation to the foundation of Islam in America. And that is to say that we have to have a proper and sound diagnosis of what the problem of racism actually is in our community if we are going to try to root it out. Simply talking about the past through hadith, as the brother has capably done in referring to seerah, or talking about it through historical materials, the way that I'm going to do in this historical lecture, will not be enough, because knowledge alone is not going to remove the scourge of racism from our community or from the broader society. We have to understand what a properly Quranic diagnosis of the problem of racism is in order to actually be able to take the steps that are required to remove racism. We actually have to have a proper Quranic understanding of it. Who is the first racist in history? Iblis. Iblis is the first racist in history because when he is commanded to bow to our forefather Adam alayhi salam, he says, I'm better than him. I'm made from fire, he's made from clay. On the basis of his origins and his bodily substance, he claims superiority over another one of God's creatures. So don't believe people when they tell you that racism is inherent in human nature. It is not. A human being that is in their fitra, the way that they were framed by the fatra samawati wal ard, the innate disposition that a human being has, he knows he is created from dirt and there is nothing lower than dirt. He does not rank himself in terms of superiority or inferiority with respect to other creations made of dirt. What handful of dirt is better than the next? It is only the insinuations of satanic religion, the whispering in the ears of human beings, that convinces people to rank themselves as superior and inferior to one another. The shaitan convinces us to see ourselves the way he sees us, to detest ourselves, or to detest one another the way that he detests us. And if you understand a proper Quranic diagnosis of the problem of racism, lectures will not be enough. We have to get a magnet to remove these corruptions and impurities from our heart. And know that the greatest single historical expression of racism and that sin of pride that Iblis tries to instill in the children of Adam is white supremacy. White supremacy is the greatest single historical expression of that timeless evil. And we have to uproot it from our communities as well. We have fallen victim to this age-old sin because we as Muslims know the racial politics in our own community. And we know that the reason why I'm here to give a talk about invisible Muslims, Islam in West Africa and the Americas is because we don't think very much about black people usually when we think about Islam. We're not aware, for example, that Africa is probably the only continent on the world with a Muslim majority, that there are 315 million Muslims that live in sub-Saharan Africa, which is more than twice as many Muslims as live in North Africa. We don't know that there are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. We don't know that there are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. We don't know that there's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. And the reason we don't know those things is because we have been duped by white supremacy into ignoring black people and the contribution of black people to this religion. I talk a lot about this not only in a 14-week-long course on Islam in Africa, but also in a book on the history of Islamic education in West Africa called The Walking Quran. The first thing is to understand that we actually have to overcome this sickness of racism. Then when we start to pull it out of our hearts, then we approach it and attack it with knowledge. We try to remedy the way that knowledge about black people has been systematically denied to us. And we try to unlearn all the racist stereotypes that we've been taught about black folks. And this is not just my problem as an African American. It's not just a problem that African Muslim immigrants from places like Senegal and Nigeria and Chad should take as their own. It is our foundational problem as an American Muslim community. And the reason is that it was African Islam that first brought Islam to these shores. There are documented instances of Muslims praying in what's now Mexico in 1504. There are documented instances of Muslims fomenting slave rebellions against their slave owners in the 1520s in Mexico. And even here, in the great state of Georgia, many Muslims were brought. I'm going to read to you briefly this letter to underline the point. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, J. Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. Not too far from here, Savannah. This is from a mid-19th century evangelical preacher's manual. And it's called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. I won't go into the details about the text. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. Doherty, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required. In addition, should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are not simply the stories of my ancestors as an African American or as an African American Muslim. These are the stories of the ancestors of our ummah. And unless we reconnect with those African roots of American Islam, then we are doomed to be dismissed as an irrelevant immigrant foreign religion. But the fact of the matter is that Islam was present in what became the United States of America before there was a United States of America. But as long as we ignore the African Muslims that established that early Muslim community, then we cut ourselves off from our own roots. We are marginalizing the one thing that cannot be argued in our anteriority in this place. We have pride of place here. But we have to understand where we come from. This is, by the way, the image that Brother Abdullah was just mentioning. The argument of my book, The Walking Quran, could be represented visually in that map, which is about the centrality of Islam to Africa, or it can be represented visually in this 16th century Turkish miniature, which is of a black man on top of the Kaaba calling the world to Islam. And that call to Islam historically in West Africa took place through schooling, took place through education. I want to point out that there was no military conquest of invading Arab armies from North Africa that established Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. Islam was established in sub-Saharan Africa voluntarily. It was spread not with the jihad of the sword, but with the jihad of the wooden board. It was spread and is still spread to this day on the kinds of wooden tablets that the companions' children learned the Quran on. Because in the early days of Islam, the Quran was taught on these wooden tablets, and it was taught on the wide, flat shoulder blades of camels and cattle. Those were the first things that the Quran was written on. And to this day in West Africa, you see the Quran taught that way. And that's been the nature of the black man's call to Islam in West Africa, that turned Africa from sub-Saharan Africa from a place with no Muslims in it in the middle of the 7th century to places where if you go from Senegal to Somalia, you go through countries that are 95, 98% Muslim. The jihad of the wooden board, and that's the jihad that we need to undertake in this country if we're to be successful. A jihad of education, and it will fail if we do not include the women. Because everything that the Muslims endeavor to undertake will fail unless women find their place in it. God favored women in countless ways, and men denigrate them. It almost seems in more ways than can be named and can be numbered. Since we've had a cartoon reference already, I'll throw one in. Not from Bugs Bunny, but from Family Guy. There's an episode where I don't know the names of any of the characters. The show's too blasphemous, so I can't really watch it, but I've seen it a few times, and in one of the episodes, the little baby and the dog are being chased around by some kind of Arab bazaar by another turbaned Arab man with tendencies towards violence. Do you know how they get the man to stop chasing them? They point and they say, "Look, a woman reading." Yeah. That's the stereotype that exists about Islam as a religion, that it denigrates women and tries to keep women from pursuing knowledge. Have we taken action to remedy this situation? In West Africa, even in the earliest times, more than a third of the students in traditional Quran schools were girls. And some of the most accomplished scholars in West African history have been women. While there are many roles that are assigned to men in this religion for devotional purposes, there is no limit for women's participation and achievement in scholarly life in Islam. And yet we systematically deny women to the main avenue through which women have expressed their historical contribution to the religion of Islam. So until we double down on how we deal with education, following in the footsteps of our African forefathers, then we will be doomed to fail in spreading Islam in this place. And we will not be able to reproduce the experiment that they conducted successfully in spreading Islam in Africa. In these places, you still find traditional majalis al-ilm, these traditional knowledge circles, sometimes schools with as many as 2,000 students where no diploma is given. No modern university sanctions the study, and people come from thousands of miles away still just to receive an ijazah. And I've been given a warning on time, so I'm going to speed through the material. But in the ancient imperial states of West Africa, in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, wealthy and powerful Muslim rulers invested not in military exploits, but in educational institutions and mosques, like these traditional mosques in the country of Mali, in the cities of Djenné and Timbuktu. The ruler of Mali in the middle of the 14th century was a person called Mansa Musa. Mansa is the Mandingo word meaning emperor, and this is how he was pictured on a 14th century Spanish atlas. He was pictured as holding an orb of gold with a crown of gold sitting upon a throne of gold, because 3/4 of the gold that circulated in North Africa and Western Europe during the medieval period came from West Africa. Mansa Musa is often estimated to be the wealthiest man that ever lived, with his net worth adjusted for inflation being estimated at $400 billion. But what he invested in was the building of mosques, the building of schools. He invested in scholarship. And that scholarship remains now that the gold is gone. Those same countries are now some of the most impoverished countries in the world because of the ravages of the slave trade, because of the trade that brought that man to that Savannah port in 1806. But the learning has remained, the Muslim identity has remained strong, and the commitment to scholarship has remained strong. This is one of the oldest surviving texts ever written by a West African in any language. And by the way, while they were crafting those stereotypes about Africans as savages so that they could enslave 15 million Africans in New World slavery, they were nonetheless benefiting from the fact that some of those enslaved African Muslims were literate in Arabic, were literate in Mandingo, were literate in Wolof, were literate in the Fulani language, and were often used to keep plantation records for their masters in Arabic, because their masters weren't literate in any language. How many of us knew any of these stories before we walked into this room? And it's because the scourge of racism keeps us from ever turning to West Africa as a source of knowledge, keeps us from turning to West Africa. It's not my history, it's not my people, it's not my ancestors. Do we worship Allah or do we worship our ancestors? The tradition that spread Islam through that peaceful jihad of the board, the one that initially implanted Islam in West Africa, traces its origins to a town in the Empire of Mali called Jaga or Jaha. It's often referred to as the Jahanke tradition, and this is one of the oldest continuous traditions of instruction. We have Jahanke teachers right here in the Atlanta metro area. And this was their approach to spreading Islam in West Africa. Unbelief is a result of ignorance rather than wickedness. It is God's will that some remain in ignorance longer than others. La ikraha fid din. There's no obligation in religion. True conversion occurs in God's time. Jihad is never an acceptable means for converting non-Muslims. As the great Tijani Sheikh Tijani Sise mentioned, when you force someone to convert to Islam, you don't gain a believer, you gain a hypocrite. So force is never an acceptable means for converting people. Jihad is legitimate only in self-defense to protect the survival of the Muslim community itself. Muslims may and should support non-Muslim rule as long as they are allowed to practice their religion, and Muslims must present an example to be emulated so non-Muslims will come to Islam. Scholarship should be the center of Muslim life to keep Islam from being corrupted. It was this approach, this tolerant approach to living surrounded by non-Muslims at all times, and to slowly teaching those people how to read God's words off of wooden tablets, that transformed West Africa from a place with no Muslims to a place that's entirely Muslim. If we want a model for how we can successfully transform this place, I suggest that we return to the paths of our forefathers, to the people that first brought Islam to these shores, and take an approach like this one. Not so focused on preaching from a position of pride about how my religion is better than yours, but by providing a service and a benefit to the people around you so that they will come to you and ask about Islam instead of you having to try to preach all the time about why what you got is better than what they got. That's what transformed Africa, West Africa specifically, into a place of Islam. And there are illustrious contemporary scholars from the Jahanke tradition, like Imam Fode Drame, who's based currently in Vancouver, and there are others as well. That civilization, built on Quran schooling, built on teaching the children of Adam and Eve God's words, and inscribing it on their very being so that they could be physical copies of the book, the way that the Prophet was the Quran walking upon the earth. That is the Islam that we need to try to replicate in this place. And yet that Islam too was challenged by the great evil of our time, white supremacy. The Atlantic slave trade pulled 12 to 15 million people out of West and West Central Africa over a period of 400 years, and at least 10 to 15% of those people were Muslims, which means that roughly 3 million Muslims were brought in chains to the New World. In today's afternoon lecture, I'm going to speak about how African Muslims used the intellectual and spiritual resources of this religion to fight against the wickedness of the Atlantic slave trade. And I'll give you just a brief precursor to this afternoon's talk so that you'll have motivation to attend. The founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. We've all been told that the abolition of the slave trade came from Christian do-gooderism, that it came from Christian moralizing that ended practices that were spread amongst the Africans and amongst the Arabs. These are words from the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of Slavery, who praised a West African Muslim ruler for abolishing the institution of slavery in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s. The first modern nation anywhere on the face of the earth to abolish the institution of slavery was in West Africa. And that was acknowledged by Europeans in the 18th century. To the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous Imam, this is a reference to Imam Abdul Qadir Khan. Al-Mami is the Fulani representation of the word El-Imam. To the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous Al-Mami sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce and the human race. And when we consider this amiable man as having been trained up in a land of slavery and as having had in the introduction of such a revolution all the prejudices of education and custom to oppose, when we consider him again as sacrificing a part of his own revenue, as refusing the presence of Europeans, and as exposing himself in consequence of it to the vindictive ravages of the agents of the latter, he is certainly more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a much nobler sacrifice than they and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. That's how an Episcopalian priest at the end of the 18th century could praise a West African Muslim abolitionist. And do you know how he effected his abolition? Keeping in mind that the goal of that West African Islamic education was not to teach somebody the Quran in their head, but to make them a living copy of the book, Abdul Qadir Khan decided that not even a single verse of the Book of God should ever be held in bondage. He gave freedom to any enslaved person in his lands that would recite a single ayah of the Quran. They said to him, the same way that they said to our hero, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala an, when Umar would set free any of the captives that he found praying during the wars for the establishment of Islam. He said, they would say to Umar, "Oh, commander of the faithful, don't you know that they're just deceiving you so that you'll set them free?" He said, better to be deceived by one who deceives us in favor of God than to keep in bondage one who prays to him. That is the reasoning that allowed West African Muslims to be at the vanguard of humanistic thinking at the end of the 18th century. So I invite you to learn more about the history of my ancestors and yours. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
You are the best people evolved for mankind because you enjoin the good and you forbid the evil. America's greatest chance, without a doubt, are the Muslims who do their job.
Let us be very, very clear that our presence here in the United States of America is the best thing that ever happened to this country.
The first modern nation anywhere on the face of the earth to abolish the institution of slavery was in West Africa. Islam was present in what became the United States of America before there was a United States of America.
Our job is simply to show the oneness of Allah. That's our struggle. And if we do that, America benefits.
We live in a country where we need to understand our history as Muslims. Islam has been on the shores of this nation since the days of its founding. This country right here is our country, and we deserve to live here like everybody else.